Some warships are built for the history books. HMS Warspite was built to rewrite them and then set those books on fire. She's the legendary grand old lady who spent 30 years punching the world's most dangerous navies in the mouth, and somehow she lived to tell the tale. At first glance, Warspite was a bit of a disaster. She had a magnetic personality, and by that I mean she couldn't stop ramming her own sister ships or running herself aground. She even had a steering gear with a mind of its own that decided to fail at the worst possible moments. But don't let the clumsiness fool you. From surviving a literal death spiral under the guns of the entire German high seas fleet at Jutland, to landing a 15-mile sniper shot that remains one of the longest in naval history. This ship was a walking contradiction. She was part miracle, part gladiator, and 100% too stubborn to sink. Even when the war ended and she was sold for scrap, she refused to go quietly. She broke her chains and ran herself aground, choosing a warrior's grave over the indignity of the blowtorch. Today, we're deconstructing the unrivaled records of the most decorated warship in British history. Grab your life jackets, it's time to meet the grand old lady. To understand the legend of the Warspite, we have to go back to May 31st, 1916. The North Sea, a gray, miserable stretch of water that was about to host the largest naval clash in history, the Battle of Jutland. This was supposed to be the moment the British Royal Navy asserted its dominance once and for all. Warspite was there as part of the 5th Battle Squadron, a group of Queen Elizabeth-class Titans that were essentially the heavy hitters of the fleet. They were faster, tougher, and carried bigger guns than almost anything the Germans had. But as we mentioned, Warspite had a bit of a complicated relationship with luck. The chaos started before a single shot was fired. Thanks to a series of signaling blunders by Admiral Beatty, the kind of lost in translation moment you really don't want in a World War Warspite, and her sisters were left lagging behind. By the time they caught up, they weren't just joining a fight. They were walking into a buzzsaw. They found themselves staring down the throat of the entire German high seas fleet. For most ships, this would be the end of the story. For Warspite, it was just the warm-up. As the sky turned into a horizontal rain of steel, Warspite started dealing out punishment trading blows with German ships like the Von der Tann and the Markgraf. But then the Warspite jinx struck. A heavy shell from the German battleship HMS Kaiser slammed into her port engine room. On any other ship, that's a tragedy. On Warspite, it was the start of her most famous and most accidental act of heroism. The hit jammed her steering gear. Hard. Instead of turning away from the fight to safety, Warspite did something that looked like a move of insane bravado. She started steering in a massive, lumbering circle. And she didn't just do it once. She did it twice. She was performing a death spiral right in front of the concentrated fury of the German line. To the Germans, she looked like a wounded beast offering itself up for the kill. They shifted all their fire onto the circling giant, turning the sea around her into a boiling cauldron of explosions. But here's where the legend outshines the logic. At that exact moment, the armored cruiser HMS Warrior was sinking nearby, helpless and exposed. Because Warspite was busy doing accidental donuts in the middle of a war zone, she drew every single German shell away from the Warrior. The crew of the Warrior watched in awe, convinced that Warspite's captain was a madman or a saint deliberately sacrificing his ship to save theirs. In reality, the crew of the Warspite was below decks, frantic, fighting a jammed rudder, while 15 heavy-caliber shells ripped into the ship's superstructure. It was a nightmare of fire and twisted metal. But the old lady was tough. Even with her rangefinders destroyed and her decks a mess, she kept her cool. When the steering was finally wrestled back into some semblance of control, she didn't sink. She just shook it off. The Germans, likely confused and definitely frustrated, couldn't finish the job. Warspite was ordered to limp back to port, but the drama wasn't over. On her way home, battered and bruised, she encountered 2 different German U-boats. In her typical get-out-of-my-way fashion, she dodged their torpedoes and even tried to ram one of them while she was still half sinking. She eventually made it back to the docks, looking like she'd been through a meat grinder. The damage was so severe, it took 2 months to repair, and that jammed rudder. It left a permanent scar. For the rest of her 30-year career, the Warspite would always have a gremlin in her steering, a little reminder of the day she stared down the entire German Navy and refused to blink. She had survived Jutland, saved a cruiser, and earned her first taste of immortality. But as the smoke cleared over the North Sea, the world had no idea that the grand old lady was just getting started. If Jutland was Warspite's baptism by fire, the Mediterranean was her coronation. After the Great War, most ships would have been sent to the scrapyard. But the Royal Navy knew the old lady had more to give. In the mid-1930s, she went under the knife for a massive reconstruction. She got a new superstructure, better armor, and more powerful engines. But in a classic display of her stubborn personality, even a total rebuild couldn't fix her cursed steering gear. She emerged as a modern titan, but she still had that same eccentric limp from her days in the North Sea. When World War II broke out, Warspite didn't just join the fight. She started breaking records immediately. In April 1940, she was sent to the freezing fjords of Narvik, Norway. While her big guns were busy terrorizing German destroyers, her catapult-launched Swordfish seaplane spotted the German submarine U-64 and sent it to the bottom. This wasn't just a kill. It was the first time in history a submarine had been sunk by a plane launched from a battleship. Warspite was officially a pioneer of the new age of naval warfare. But the real legendary stuff happened when she headed south to the Mediterranean. This was where she earned the nickname that would define her legacy. In July 1940, she found herself leading the charge at the Battle of Calabria against the Italian Regia Marina. Admiral Cunningham, a man who loved a good fight almost as much as Warspite did, pushed the ship to her limits. This is where the sniper part comes in. Warspite locked her sights on the Italian flagship, the Giulio Cesare. The distance was staggering, about 24 kilometers, or roughly 15 miles. To put that in perspective, at that range, the enemy ship is a tiny speck on the horizon. A shell fired from Warspite's 15-inch guns had to travel through the air for nearly a full minute, arching high into the atmosphere before plunging back down. It wasn't just a shot. It was a ballistic miracle. Clang! Warspite landed a direct hit on the Cesare's rear funnel. It remains one of the longest range hits ever achieved by a moving battleship on a moving target. The Italians, realizing they were trading punches with a legendary marksman who could hit them from a different zip code, decided they had seen enough and retreated. With one single shell, the old lady had asserted her dominance over the entire Mediterranean. But she wasn't done being a nightmare for the Italian fleet. Fast forward to March 1941, the Battle of Cape Matapan. This time the fight happened under the cover of pitch-black darkness. While most navies at the time were terrified of night fighting, the British had a secret weapon radar. Warspite and her sisters, Valiant and Barham, used their tech to creep up on a group of Italian heavy cruisers that had no idea they were being hunted. When the British battleships turned on their searchlights, the Italians were only a few thousand yards away, point-blank range for a 15-inch gun. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. In a matter of minutes, Warspite helped vaporize 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. In the silence of the night, the old lady had proven she was just as deadly in the dark as she was at long range. By this point, the Mediterranean had become Warspite's personal playground. She had become a psychological weapon. When the grand old lady was on the horizon, the enemy knew that luck was no longer on their side. However, as the war dragged on, the world was about to introduce a new kind of terror, one that not even Warspite's thick armor could fully ignore. By 1943, the Mediterranean was supposed to be a victory lap for the grand old lady. Italy had surrendered, and the Regia Marina, the fleet Warspite had spent years bullying, was now being escorted into captivity by none other than Warspite herself. It was a moment of supreme triumph. But the Germans weren't interested in the ceremony. They had a new toy, a terrifying glimpse into the future of warfare called the Fritz X. This was the world's first guided glide bomb, the great-grandfather of the modern smart bomb. And it was designed specifically to kill giants like Warspite, while providing shore bombardment for the Allied landings at Salerno. The sky literally fell on the old lady. 3 of these guided missiles were launched from high-altitude bombers. One missed, one exploded near her torpedo bulge, but the third was a bullseye. The armor-piercing monster slammed into the ship near her funnel, ripped through 6 decks, and punched a massive 20-foot hole right through the bottom of her hull. In an instant, Warspite was a ghost of a ship. She took on 5,000 tons of water. She lost all steam, all power, and all her lights. She was a dead 30,000-ton hunk of steel drifting toward the enemy shore. Any other ship would have rolled over and slid into the abyss. But Warspite, true to her nature, just refused to sink. Her crew fought like demons to keep her afloat while she was towed through the Straits of Messina. In a classic bit of Warspite drama, she even broke her tow lines and started drifting sideways through the narrow channel as if she were trying to ram the Italian coast one last time, just for old time's sake. When she finally reached a dock, the diagnosis was grim. The Royal Navy was stretched thin. They didn't have the time or the resources to give her a proper shipyard repair. So they did something that sounds like a DIY nightmare. They patched that massive gaping hole in her belly with a literal concrete plug. Think about that for a second. One of the most legendary warships in history was now sailing around with a giant block of cement holding her together. She was down to 1 functional boiler room, her speed was crippled, and one of her main turrets was permanently out of action. She was essentially a floating fortress, held together by spite and masonry. But there was a massive job coming up, and the Admiralty knew they needed the old lady's 15-inch guns for the big one, Operation Overlord. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the German defenders at Normandy woke up to a nightmare on the horizon. Despite her concrete plug and her limp, Warspite was the first ship in the entire Allied fleet to open fire. At 5:13 a.m., her guns roared, slamming shells into the German coastal batteries at Villarville. She wasn't just supporting the troops. She was trying to delete the French coastline from the map. She fired so many rounds so consistently that her gun barrels literally wore out. The rifling was gone. She was essentially firing smoothbore pipes. She had to sail back to Britain to get her guns replaced, and on the way, she hit a magnetic mine. Most ships would have called it a career right there. But Warspite She just shrugged off the explosion, got her new guns, and then limped back to the front lines with only 3 working propellers and a skeleton crew. She spent the rest of the summer sailing up and down the coast, a scarred concrete-patched brawler that simply wouldn't go home until the job was done. She was broken, battered, and technically unfit for service. Yet she was still the most feared thing in the English Channel. But even for a legend, the clock was ticking. The grand old lady had one final act left to play, and it wouldn't happen in a battle, but in a storm. After the smoke cleared at Normandy, the Warspite was more a collection of scars than a functional battleship. She was a patched-up, concrete-filled brawler with worn-out guns and a steering gear that still liked to play games. But despite the damage, the nickname she had picked up earlier in the war had finally stuck for good. She wasn't just HMS Warspite anymore. She was the Grand Old Lady. The name didn't come from a poet or a historian. It came from the man who knew her best, Admiral Andrew Cunningham. During the high-stakes operations in the Mediterranean, the old lady was doing what she did best, dodging air attacks and hauling her massive frame across the sea at speeds that shouldn't have been possible for a ship her age. Cunningham, watching her maneuver with the grace of a much younger vessel during a high-speed run to Malta, sent a legendary signal. Operation well carried out. There is no question when the old lady lifts her skirts, she can run. In the stiff, formal world of the Royal Navy, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. It was a recognition that this 30-year-old veteran still had the heart of a thoroughbred, and she had the jewelry to prove she was the queen of the fleet. By the time 1945 rolled around and the global firestorm of World War II finally began to flicker out, Warspite had racked up 15 battle honors. To put that in perspective, that is the most awards ever bestowed upon a single ship in the entire history of the Royal Navy. Her resume looked like a map of the greatest hits of naval warfare: Jutland, Narvik, Norway, Calabria, Maritime Mediterranean, Malta, Convoy, Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy. She had been there at the start in 1912, she had reached the absolute peak of her power in the 1940s, and she had stayed until the final curtain call. She was the most decorated warrior of the sea, a ship that had stared down every threat the 20th century could throw at her, from dreadnoughts to dive bombers to guided missiles, and came out swinging every single time. But when the guns finally went silent, the grand old lady faced an enemy she couldn't outrange or outmaneuver: bureaucracy. Post-war Britain was a different world. The empire was exhausted, the treasury was empty, and the era of the massive battleship was officially over. Aircraft carriers and submarines were the new kings, and to the bean counters in London, Warspite wasn't a hero. She was just 30,000 tons of high-grade steel that could be recycled into refrigerators and cars. There was a massive public outcry to save her, a desperate campaign to turn her into a permanent museum ship. People argued that if any vessel deserved to be preserved as a monument to British grit, it was the one that had saved a cruiser at Jutland, sniped a flagship at 24 kilometers, and sailed to Normandy with a hole plugged with cement. But the Admiralty was cold. They were done with the past. They refused the petitions, ignored the sentiment, and in 1946, they stripped her of her remaining dignity. They decommissioned her and sold her to the breakers for scrap. It was a heartbreaking end for a legend, a quiet, bureaucratic death for a ship that had survived the greatest naval clashes in human history. They intended for her to be towed to a scrapyard where men with blowtorches would dismantle her piece by piece until she was nothing but a memory. However, The men in London had forgotten one very important detail. Warspite was a ship that lived by her own rules and died by her own terms. She had spent 30 years refusing to sink, and she wasn't about to let a group of accountants decide how her story ended. The grand old lady had one final spectacular act of rebellion left in her system, and it was going to be the most Warspite thing she ever did. In April 1947, the tow ropes were finally tightened. The grand old lady was stripped of her guns, her engines were cold, and she was being dragged like a captive toward the breakers at Faslane. To the men on the tugboats, this was just another job. To the Admiralty, it was the final chapter of a long overdue retirement. But as they rounded the coast of Cornwall, the Atlantic Ocean decided to give the Warspite one last chance to show the world who she really was. A fierce gale roared in Turning Mounts Bay into a chaotic mess of white foam and crashing waves. Any other ship would have been a victim of the storm. Warspite used it as an opportunity for a mutiny. In a final spectacular display of her legendary stubbornness, she snapped her tow lines. She didn't just drift away. She broke free. Remember that magnetic collision field we talked about? The one that made her ram everything in sight for 30 years. It flared up one last time. As the tugs tried to move in and recapture her, she battered them back, refusing to be tamed. She drifted through the storm, ghosting across the waves, until she slammed hard into the rocks at Prussia Cove. The authorities were furious. They sent more tugs, more salvage crews, and more equipment to pull her off the rocks and get her back to the scrap heap. But the old lady just dug in her heels. She refloated herself just enough to move to an even more inaccessible spot, then ran herself aground again at Mounts Bay. It was as if she was telling the world, "You want my steel? You're going to have to come and get it on my terms." She had spent her life under the command of admirals and kings, but in her final hours, she answered to no one. Because she had run aground in such a treacherous, rocky location, it was impossible to tow her away. The Royal Navy finally had to admit defeat. They couldn't take her to the scrapyard, so they had to bring the scrapyard to her. For the next several years, she was dismantled right there on the very coast she had spent her life protecting. She died with the salt spray of the English Channel on her hull and the rocks of Cornwall beneath her keel. She didn't end up as a pile of anonymous metal in a Scottish shipyard. She ended up as a part of the coastline. HMS Warspite wasn't just a collection of rivets and 15-inch guns. She was a survivor. She was the ship that survived the death circle at Jutland, and the ship that sniped the Italians at 24 kilometers, and the ship that fought at Normandy with a belly full of concrete. She was a warrior that earned 15 battle honors, and then had the audacity to stage a one-ship rebellion against her own retirement. History is full of great ships, but there was only one grand old lady. She was a walking contradiction, clumsy, unlucky, brilliant, and absolutely indestructible. She lived long enough to see the world change forever, and when it was time to go, she chose a warrior's grave over a coward's end. If you think the Warspite deserved to be a museum, or if you just have a soft spot for a legendary ship that refused to take orders from anyone, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into the DNA of history's most incredible machines every week, and we'd love to have you on the crew. Drop a comment below and let us know which legendary warship we should cover next. Thanks for watching, and remember, as long as we tell her story, the grand old lady is still sailing. We'll see you in the next one.